Hi everyone, and welcome to The Climate of Sport with me, Claire Poole, the podcast where we explore how the world of sport can drive climate action, champion equality and shape a more sustainable future. From the boardroom to the locker room, from grassroots to global stages, the game is changing and so are we. Let's get into it. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. I am delighted to be back with you. And welcome to your climate hat trick. 3 big stories from the world of sport each week with a sustainability or climate angle. And I'm going to talk to you about what happened, what it means and why it matters. So let's get into it. Story 1 is a strange twist at the LA Marathon has people talking. The LA Marathon awards finisher medals to those who complete 18 miles of the 26.2 mile course. So basically, the LA Marathon happened last weekend. The weather forecast for that day was warmer than a typical LA Marathon, reaching a high of 87 or 88 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. The average for this time of year on that day is around 69 degrees. So nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius hotter than usual. The marathon website said what to expect on race day. Sunday is shaping up to be a warm, sunny day across the Los Angeles Marathon course from Dodger Stadium to Century City. While it's slightly warmer than a typical LA Marathon race day with the right preparation, you could have an amazing day. Further down the website, there's a header that says, having a tough day, and then goes on to say, if you're having a tough day and want to end your race before the 26.2 miles, you can choose to take the turn at mile 18 and head to the finish line early. You do not need to notify anyone of your decision, and you can opt to take this route at any time. This option is available for this year only. It then goes on with some directional instructions and signage to look for, and then says at the end, you will receive your finisher medal and any challenger medal you've earned, and your official race results will be updated at a later date to reflect your time and mileage. There is no shame in making a smart decision for your body. Props to the LA Marathon for giving people options on what is always a tough day. I think when you're running a marathon, it's going to be a tough day. But clearly, they are raising awareness of the warm temperatures and encouraging people to make a smart decision for their body. As you can imagine, this has led to mixed reviews online, and there have been a slew of negative comments. New York Post said marathon quitters don't deserve medals, and other news sources have said it's snowflake culture run amok, called pathetic by fans, and online influencers have said people should be ashamed of themselves, which is quite vitriolic for what is basically a voluntary participation event. But of course, everyone has an opinion on that. Clearly, from our perspective in the climate and sustainability space, it was an operational decision to ensure people stayed safe and completed a course and received what they were looking for completing an arduous challenge. And 18 miles in 30 degrees is nothing to be sniffed at as well. But also, of course, it is in the 26.2 miles. That is your marathon length. So what are we thinking about when it comes to this? It's another reminder that climate change is making normal race conditions less predictable. Events designed around historical weather patterns at certain times of year are now continuing to encounter new extremes. The temperature reached 31 degrees or 87 degrees Fahrenheit, so more than 10 degrees Celsius above the seasonal average. Organisers are increasingly being forced to adapt the events around historical weather patterns to a climate that no longer behaves predictably. As extreme events become more common, obviously organisers of endurance sports are going to have to rethink what a safe participation looks like. We've already seen things like earlier start times, we've seen more hydration stations, shaded recovery areas, and now we're seeing contingency routes, the LA Marathon giving a mile 18 finish. The backlash, I think, highlights something we need to consider in the world of climate sustainability and sport. It reminds us that there's going to be a cultural divide around climate adaptation. Practical safety measures are reframed as weakness rather than preparation for the changing environmental conditions. And that's something I think we need to act off. I've been thinking, is there something in the language that could help us? This idea of having a tough day as the framing, but acknowledging what the LA Marathon will have been dealing with operationally around this decision, trying to ensure the safety of participants, trying to give people a medal after they've been training probably for a year for this day and then encountering really extreme conditions. props to the LA Marathon for putting something in place that keeps people safe. And I don't envy their decision making here. They don't want to be alarming by saying the heat's going to be extreme, but they want people to have the option. The pylon of negative press, I think, begins to stem from this having a tough day framing. Every marathon day is going to be a tough day if you're not Eliud Kipchoge. Not to say that people wouldn't already say something about this and media outlets wouldn't cover it in this way, even if it wasn't framed in this way. But I wonder if we can reflect on other ways that that could have been said. Could the outcomes have been different? This obviously has to position the decision on personal judgment, making sure people understand it's not an unsafe race environment, which obviously is an important legal distinction. But I haven't come up with anything amazing, to be honest, thinking about adjusting to race day conditions, for example, more neutral language. However, implies there that the race day conditions are or more difficult, and organisers need to be very careful around this. I think the language used by organisers of listening to your body or finishing early if they're having a tough day reflects how endurance events are having to increasingly manage heat risk. Behind this phrasing is the practical reality that race directors must balance participant safety, legal liability, and the growing challenge of hotter race day conditions. If you've got ideas on another way that this could have been phrased that is around climate adaptation, but also taking care of yourself, I would love to hear about it. I think this is the ongoing challenge of communications around sustainability in sport when we're having these sorts of issues. So, it's a telling example of how sporting events are beginning to adapt to the heat risk in Los Angeles. And this is, of course, increasingly relevant as the city prepares to host the 2028 Summer Olympics. This already happening in March. What are we going to be experiencing in June and July in a few years' time? And of course, the US is preparing for the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup, which brings us on to story 2, the commercialization of climate adaptation. FIFA has said that broadcasters can show adverts during hydration breaks at the FIFA Men's World Cup this summer in the US. So let's start at the beginning on this one. In December 2025, it was announced that players will benefit from 3-minute hydration breaks in each half of games as, quote, FIFA prioritizes player welfare throughout next summer's tournament co-hosted by Canada, Mexico, and the United States, close quote. This followed the FIFA Club World Cup in 2025, really high temperatures, games were stopped for hydration breaks at a number of games, and it's also happened at previous World Cups as well, where the wet bulb temperature reached 32 degrees and therefore kicked in the heat rule. So while ostensibly FIFA announced this is a player welfare issue for those eagle-eyed environmental people in sport, it was notable that this announcement was made at the World Broadcaster meeting held in Washington, D.C. So 4 months later from that announcement, now 3 months ahead of the tournament, March 2026, FIFA have announced that broadcasters can show adverts during hydration breaks at FIFA's Men's World Cup with certain stipulations. So those stipulations are the ad break shouldn't start within 20 seconds of the ref's whistle pausing play. They should return to the match feed more than 30 seconds before play resumes. So essentially, you've got 2 minutes and 10 seconds for advertising. Then there are stipulations around the advertising too. If broadcasters do split the screen or don't fully cut away, they're only allowed to sell advertising to FIFA sponsors. If the broadcaster cuts away entirely to full screen ads, it is allowed to sell those spots to anyone. And in stadiums, FIFA will continue to control the branding of the breaks. So more branding inside the stadium, and there are stipulations for broadcasters who want to sell additional advertising at these moments. Why this matters and what we can think about: there is an ongoing tension between climate action and the commercials of sport. Sustainability is prioritized by sports organizations until it butts up against performance or commercial issues. But sport is around performance. And of course, in 2026, it's around commercials. So this is not breaking news. However, what I think we're seeing here is probably the first example of a climate adaptation leading specifically and directly to commercial opportunity. So high temperatures are forcing hydration breaks. That's a visible sign of climate impact in elite sport. Even fans watching from home are seeing these climate adaptations now in real time. So they are going to see a hydration break. The advertising that overlays shows how climate change is driving an intersection with broadcasting business model. It's creating new conversations around how climate adaptation is monetized or communicated as well. This is breaking new ground in structuring commercial content around health and safety pauses, and it's a model that could spread to other sports, especially as climate-driven interruptions become more common. I think for me, this is a moment to explore how commercial imperatives and climate adaptation intersect in sport governance. You're going to have your own views about whether this is right or not. Would we love to see these hydration breaks happening, like brought to you by the climate crisis? Yes. Is that going to happen? Probably not. Could we encourage these breaks where they are connected to climate adaptations to be aligned with perhaps climate positive organizations or perhaps campaigns or information around the climate crisis? Yes. Could we use it as an educational opportunity? I'd love it. What we're seeing already is this commercial adaptation. So we'll see what happens after this. I think there is massive opportunities for discussion around this and what it means. And I think we'll see a lot more about that over the summer. So another adaptation measure and our final story. Story 3, technology transfer from sport to climate solutions. So this is about McLaren Racing and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation putting their coral restoration technology into play, which they announced this week. So 2 years after this unlikely collaboration, an F1 team and marine scientists, these two organizations, McLaren Racing and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, have reached a milestone in their mission to accelerate coral reef recovery. They had the first public reveal of their Machine 1, a breakthrough semi-automated coral seeding system, which is designed to solve one of reef restoration's most persistent constraints, which is speed. So now we get the connection between F1 and the drive to survive, the need for speed. This is where an F1 team has come in to help. So, sidebar, did you know that coral is an animal, not a plant? Coral seeding is essentially IVF for these sessile marine animals. So reef restoration, it accelerates coral recovery by collecting wild spawn, rearing the larvae in nurseries, and then settling them into specialized protective seeding units. And these young coral are then sown or deployed into degrading reefs to boost survival rates, enhance genetic diversity, and encourage natural reproduction. So it's an incredible scheme and a really important one, as we know our coral reefs are really endangered by the climate crisis and by warming oceans. Drawing on McLaren's high performance engineering mindset, this machine completes a process that usually takes 90 seconds in as little as 10 seconds. So early modeling suggests it has the potential to assemble 100,000 coral seeding devices per week. Planting can go from 100,000 a year to 1 million a year at a major cost reduction. Scientists already know how to grow coral, but the bottleneck has always been how fast you can plant it. So this coral spawning is a synchronized event, and it happens in a narrow window once a year. So again, we can already start to see how sport can play a role, especially in elite performance sport like F1. Obviously, it's high stakes, it's tight timelines, and there's no room for delay. So this, what seemed like a unlikely collaboration perhaps, now makes a lot of sense as we learn a little bit more. The project is highlighting great opportunity of applying elite engineering performance and that thinking in sport to environmental challenges, which it would be brilliant to see more of. And by adapting Formula One's rapid prototyping and optimization approach, McLaren's new coral seeding system could increase reef restoration capacity tenfold, demonstrating how technology developed for racing can help tackle one of the planet's most urgent ecological crises. So they are our 3 stories for this week. That is our climate hat trick. As a reminder, story 1, a strange twist at the LA Marathon has people talking. Story 2, commercializing climate adaptation at the World Cup. And story 3, technology transfer from sport to climate solutions. Let's head now to the latest in our leadership interview series. I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by Hannah Buckley, who is Head of Infrastructure, Safety and Sustainability at WSL. Hannah, welcome to the pod.
Hi, Claire. Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. We are, at the time of recording, just coming up on the Subway Women's League Cup Final 2026 here in the UK, which is a clash between Man United and Chelsea. So super exciting and a big moment for women's football, women's soccer here in the UK. So just to frame this, out before we get into it with Hannah. Women's sport's often compared to men's sport and framed as being behind men's sport. From a sustainability perspective, I think that framing of being different to men's sport is actually its greatest advantage. We have in women's sport globally new leagues, new infrastructures, new sponsorship models, and fewer legacy systems to untangle. So this is a real opportunity for women's sport around low carbon venue design, regenerative partnerships, biodiversity positive development, climate aligned sponsors, and so much more. So women's sport doesn't need to replicate any previous models. It can leapfrog it. It can come at these incredible leagues, these incredible matches, these incredible sports at a completely different way. So with that in mind, Hannah, I want to come to you and ask, tell us first of all about you and your role at the WSL. You've got 3 areas there. Talk to us about that.
Yes, certainly. So first of all, I think infrastructure is a great one. And that really, what is that? That's stadiums and training grounds, which obviously are fundamental to our women's football teams to, dare I say it, house their employees and then those flagship moments, as you've just alluded to there with the League Cup final. Safety and security obviously is a critical part for us when we've got lots of people coming to venues. And then obviously the strand that we're most here to talk about today is obviously sustainability arm, which I describe the 3 functions as actually a Venn diagram, in that each one of them actually has a natural lever to one another. And we've created this stadium design guidance through the lens for her, which is for all venues across the globe, looking at those that are building new and enhancing existing. And it takes you through the whole design cycle. But there's a real specific section on there for those of you looking to build for the future and to build it as sustainably as possible. It can be found on wslfootball.com in the publications section at the bottom. We value any feedback that people have. In our stadium design guidance, we're really clear to talk very much around what happens if climate change occurs, where should our stadiums be and how does that connect in? But then we're also talking about concourses from a safety and security point of view. So if you want to retrofit something and enhance the stadium, so the example I like to use a lot is the water stations. Well, if you bring those in, that implicates, the flow and the movement of people into stadiums. So I think all the time, everything has a natural fit against those 3 themes. And I feel really privileged to be in a helicopter position working across Premier League stadiums, English Football League stadiums, and rugby league stadiums, and some women's only stadiums, like the example at the Joy Stadium that Man City built many years ago.
Fantastic. So you've already started alluding to some brilliant examples of sustainability there that are happening inside the WSL. So share more with us a little bit, maybe other work that's happening that you haven't mentioned, and importantly, what you've got your sights on next in terms of progress.
Yeah, so I think it's important just to share that WSL football is now a business in its own right, which is really important because historically we've been part of the national governing body, the Football Association, fell under their strategy, fell under their policies. And obviously being a new entity in this startup mode presents a real opportunity. And our leadership team are really keen to ensure that we test and learn. And I think using that sort of sense of direction, what we've tried to do is put in place some systems to allow us to really test and learn. And the example I'll give, and it's probably what I'm most excited about, is we've created an internal sustainability action group called iSwag. I won't take credit for that, by the way. That's the content people. Yeah, a bit swaggy.
Love that.
But tactically for us, what was a recognition is that every department, whether you're in comms, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in commercial, whether you're in football operations. So we were the first league ever to go to digital team sheets. So if you know anything about football, you know that team sheet exchange with the referee is a really important piece. And the League Cup final in the previous season was the first option to actually try that. And that was brought about through new commercial partners, new technology. And so if you imagine all this low-hanging fruit, all of a sudden, people are asking the question of could we do it differently? What's our supply chain? Where are we coming from? And that ties in really nicely to the fact that we've just received our 3rd year of carbon footprinting. So even though we were part of a big organization, we were able to extrapolate out. And even though we've doubled in size in terms of our workforce and turnover, we've actually managed to reduce our carbon footprint due to the high quality of our data. And I think that speaks volumes about doing brilliant basics, putting in place, really important tools and challenging everybody in how they do things versus why they do things. And I'm pleased to report that, as I say, kind of running parallel to that, working collaboratively with our friends at the FA, the Premier League and the EFL, football is one big family. You touched upon it at the start there. But we're in a unique position that we've got a different audience, different fan base. Our players are different for lots of different reasons. And I'm not going to go into the nuances of male and females. But, first and foremost, I think what's really great for us is when we talk to the clubs is they recognise there's an opportunity to work with the women's teams and their players to actually amplify some of this messaging in a slightly different way. So short term, quick action plan for us as a business. Long term, we're slowly building up case studies with each of our clubs, noting that some of them are independent and don't have the backhouse support of men's clubs. So, for example, London City Lionesses, or more recently, Bristol City going into a new ownership group. And then, we've got clubs talking about building, so like Durham, for example. So super exciting time for us. And over the next 5 to 10 years, that transformational change, we needed to make sure we got really good foundations to set them up for success.
Yeah. And women's football, obviously, especially in the UK, women's football's exploded in recent years. In no small way, I'm sure, to the incredible Lionesses and their success at the Euros and really putting football on the map, globally and especially in the UK and Europe. With that growth, and you've spoken about that, about this momentum that's happening, does that growth bring you a bigger responsibility to lead on sustainability? Do you feel that now as the sport increases in size?
Yeah, so I think I kind of look at it through sort of 3 lenses. So the first one being is we need to listen to our fans first and foremost. We also need to listen to our players. Now, we're a global league. We're attracting some of the most talented players across the globe into, one of the world's best women's sports leagues. And so players are starting to make choices of their own. And I think, again, we've got to understand the risks of not doing it and not doing it well, but also just paying lip service to it. So actually standing up behind our actions. Claire, I've known each other a long time, and you'll know that I'm taking a really measured approach to sustainability in terms of recognizing the when to talk about it, but also being mindful that, it's only in the last 6 months that we've had our own website. So the chance to really amplify and lean into, our own channels, the fact that we've got a new brand now, it's been out in the market since the summer, gives us a real opportunity to talk with both good leadership and authority around what we're doing. But more importantly, it needs to be relevant to our audience. And I think what's really positive for me in all of this is the young girl of tomorrow could potentially be a player for us in the future. And what we've got to make sure is that we're leaving, a legacy for her, but also making sure that she's got the optimum environment to succeed in. And the way I describe that is, we could talk about lots of facets of the game, from type of playing surface to, when the season runs, how hot it might be, for example, or how many games we've lost. So there are so many complexities to it. But if the top end of the game succeeds, then the bottom end of the game, the grassroots, will really thrive. And I think, we've got a responsibility to make sure that we're, as I say, championing the player of tomorrow.
I love it. And it feels, the way you framed that is the bigger responsibility to lead on sustainability in a very natural way, in a very embedded way, in a very thoughtful way, which is fantastic to hear. Within that responsibility to lead on sustainability, are there decisions you're making now to try and avoid locking in unsustainable habits, say, for the next decade and beyond?
Yeah, so as a business, we're always iterating. And I think we're really clear that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So, for example, next season, our league is due to grow, which is super exciting. Again, thinking about some of those real basic principles, more games means more footprints on the grass. So have we done the research? Can we get the grass to grow in these horrendous winters that we've just had? What systems can we put in place to ensure that those things happen? And so what we're also trying to do is think about, what do our clubs want back from the league? And so the example I'll give is we've been and met with one of our top flight teams who have a really strong leadership team in this thematic space, and probably the most well-resourced across all of the clubs. And what we wanted to understand is how do we serve them as a league? So, for example, at the moment, from a regulatory point of view, we ask all our clubs to have a sustainability policy. But we've got new clubs coming into the journey. And, some of those clubs make really informed decisions, but some of them are budget driven, some of them are values driven. And I think what we've got to be mindful is all of our shareholders who are our clubs each of them is a different point on the racetrack in terms of their evolution and development journey. So going from the club with 3 sustainability staff to the club with none, to clubs who are non-asset owning, not in control of their own destiny. So I think what we've got to think about is how do we serve that spectrum of clubs? And then more importantly, how do we make sure that we're not making decisions that then potentially present risk to us in the long term in this space, but also in terms of knock-on consequences that we haven't necessarily, had the foresight to think about yet. Because I think, listen, we'd all love a crystal ball. For the last 3 seasons, we've had no fixture cancellations. This year, we've had 7, even though we've got fantastic, resources and tools to try and get those games away. But having had the wettest winter, grass is great and can bounce back and is resilient. But ultimately, we have to be mindful that we can't always predict what's coming over the hill, and trying to put in some of those mitigations is really important to us because, as I say, the game is at a really fragile state in terms of, there hasn't been lots of new stadiums built. And at the end of the day, it's a supply and demand conundrum. And it's a living piece of material in the middle of the play, which is where the product happens. So whilst technology is fantastic, what happens if legislation changes or, there's water shortages or, and I think trying to almost preempt some of that thought process is really important because otherwise I describe it as is you don't, you don't plan on having twins if you live in a 1-bedroom flat.
This is the great analogy. And I think, the question I asked was about what decisions you're making now to avoid locking in unsustainable habits. But what you've reflected back is the thinking that you're making to try and, because none of us can make decisions for what's going to happen in a decade. But if the thinking's right and you're going about it in the right way, then hopefully all we can do is the best we can do with the information at any given time, isn't it?
Agreed. And I think, one of the pieces of work that I'm probably most excited about at the moment is that cross-football working group that's looking at things like stadium life cycle and, what does the stadium of tomorrow need to look like for the women's game, the men's game? How many games can we get out of it? How are people going to travel to the game? Obviously, fan travel is a really hot topic for us. And I think probably I'll give you a great example around the fan travel that's really exciting for me at the moment is we are subsidising our shuttle buses for the League Cup Final, an event that we're in control of. Why? Because we're testing and learning. And at this point, sort of several days out from the fixture, we've already sold out, which tells me the demand is there if you get the product right. So I think, again, everything needs to be insight driven.
Yeah, I love that. And there was a few references I thought while you were chatting. I thought I want to come back to the league final. So one, you mentioned a crystal ball, which we haven't got, which I'm sure some fans will be interested ahead of the match this weekend. But also, I did want to ask you, and you've sort of started sharing a little bit there, for this final, how has sustainability been a factor in where it's hosted? And from a fan perspective, which obviously a lot of our listeners are fans of this podcast, what will actually look and feel different from their perspective coming to the final this year compared to previous years?
Yeah, so again, I think going back to the fact that we are, a new standalone entity, it's WSL Football's big flagship event. It's a tentpole moment for us. It's live on a free-to-air channel. And so the opportunity to shine a lens on, all of the different areas of work that are important to us as a business are really important. But honing in on a sustainability angle with this one, I think the fact that it falls alongside, a football campaign, Green Football Weekend and Protect Where You Play is good because it gives us an opportunity to help amplify that messaging. What I think is also important to us as well is acknowledging that there are other campaigns going on as well. So Unite for Access, for example, that Level Playing Field run. So we're working with influencers and content creators. Again, going back to that learning around how hard is it to get to a venue? Because let's be honest, they are a red and a blue team, and Bristol, it's a triangle, really, isn't it? So if you're trying to reduce fan travel, but I think having seen the heat map of where our fans are coming from speaks volumes about the nature of who the women's football fans are. They're fans of the players. They're not always fans of the clubs. I think we also have to, put a lens on the fact that if you go to parts of the country where it's not the Northwest or London, where, you've got concentrated demand, then potentially you're going to have a lot more reach and pull, which I think is really exciting. And so taking the games on the road, in these moments. So last year we were at Derby. Historically, we've been at Wolverhampton Wanderers and at Nottingham Forest. And so going into this particular final, what's great for us is it's a venue that puts sustainability at the heart of their decision making. They've got a track record of delivering high-end elite women's venues. So they've hosted the Lionesses, they've hosted the Red Roses and the Rugby World Cup more recently. And they're open to working with us, which I think is a real positive. They've put in place what I call some great measures around their supply chain. Their F&B comes from within sort of a 5-mile travel distance of the stadium. So if I then hone in on the fact that you can come into our League Cup final and have a drink watching the game, which is the first domestic final ever in England football, where you can actually have a drink. And it's obviously, that is a unique thing, but actually those cups are combustible in terms of, the sort of food waste chain. So we're leaving a legacy as well. And this is one of my nice bits. And it's, women's football is, we're going to leave a B hotel. Why? Because obviously pollination, and also recognizing that we've been here is important. They're massively important going back to the biodiversity point of view. And then the other bit is we're engaging with Pledgeable. So there'll be lots of fan engagement. And we're also going to shine a spotlight on some of the interventions that the Ashton Gate venue have put in place as well. So I think if that gives you a sort of a sense of what's coming, it's almost like, imagine you could pull a lever and we're trying to pull every lever, but try and understand which has the greatest influence. And the metric I just shared with you speaks volumes, I think, around the fact that, if that was a men's game at that venue, it's usually a fee charging service. So by incentivizing it, has improved the demand and uptake. So again, I think understanding what your fan wants is critical. Recognizing that legislation isn't always the same. And you asked at the very beginning of this podcast for men's and women's sport. And then most importantly, as I say, is thinking about those venues that are doing things in a more sustainable way, make them more appealing as venues to want to obviously engage and utilize with them. Because if you think about going back to the carbon footprint piece for us, we own this event. We're actually doing our own dedicated carbon footprint for this event to understand, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, going back to that, trying to improve. Every time we do something, let's do it a bit better the next time. And that's really the key message to land.
I love as well you mentioned there, for the first time at a domestic final in the UK, supporters have the option to enjoy an alcoholic drink at their seat as part of your fan choice pilot. I was going to ask you what you're most excited about for this weekend. Is it having a beer in the bowl?
Well, I think there's several things really. One is obviously recognising all the mums out there because it's Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Two is obviously, making sure that it's a good game. I think none of us want a 0-0 draw and penalties. Two is that, we get the game away safely and securely, and that going back to the fan choice pilot, it's just that, it's a choice. I think the important thing is recognising that our audience base and our risk profile is very different to that of the men's game. And, drinking responsibly is the key thing, as well as I say, making sure that we bring the party atmosphere and leave memories for young people that will be inspired, to potentially engage in football or, dare I say it, have a role to play in it in the future. We're really excited as well to have Pledgeable with us, and they're going to be engaging with our fans in the fan zone, and most importantly, hearing what they want to see going forward from WSL football in this thematic space.
Yeah, absolutely. And having been at so many women's football games, the energy will be brought anyway, come what may. And I think that's it. The fan profile, as you mentioned, it's just another insight to how, even though they're playing the same game on the pitch, the fan base and the way things happen in women's football is so different to men's football. And another great example of how just following the same model is not what's happening, and how there's really a path being carved out for women's sport. So Hannah, lovely to hear from you so far, and so much great content in there. Just a few quick questions to finish with. Can you tell us about a hard decision you've had to make on climate? I ask this from the perspective, you've got infrastructure, you've got safety and sustainability. Sometimes decisions have to be made in a hierarchy. Is there a moment you can remember where you think, this is a really hard decision, I want to do something sustainable, but this is taking precedence?
Yeah, it's I describe one of my main jobs is to get the game on every week. And we only have a certain number of pitch protection systems. And obviously when inclement weather hits in this country, it tends to hit everywhere, and I don't have enough systems to deploy across all of them. And so sometimes we have to make some hard decisions around where we deploy. And there's lots of factors go into that. And the way I describe it is the calendar of sport, no matter what sport you're talking about, is complex. And, athletes need to be traveling to the next venue or going on an international break or whatever it might be. And so, fixture delivery is critical. And I take it very personally when a game doesn't get away. And as I say, knowing that for the fans and the players, that it's really hard. But I also very mindful of how hard our grounds teams work in really challenging circumstances and, the human impact sometimes these things have. So just trying to be mindful of the knock-on consequences of your decision making. But also sometimes you can't tell the whole truth, if that makes sense, in the media, because there's so many variables. And so hopefully that gives a sense of, some of I can't go into the intricacies of all these decisions, but yeah, it's sometimes the hardest ones are the ones that hurt the most.
Yeah, and that's so thoughtful and interesting insight. And I think that insight you shared there, I think will really resonate with our listeners, because there's so much nuance to this. And I think starting to normalize that as well, that things don't always happen the way we want. And actually, we often talk about the people versus the organizations versus the leagues. There's so many passionate people and people who take everything they do in this space so personally and so strongly and want to create the best for everyone. And it's not always possible. And I think it's a great reminder as well of the human beings that sit at the heart of some of these decisions and these headlines, and the fact that we're all just cracking on and trying to get the best to happen in a safe and sustainable and really positive way. So thank you so much for sharing that insight as well, which I think is a brilliant way to finish it. Such a timely reminder as well. So thank you so much for taking the time, Hannah Buckley, who is Head of Infrastructure, Safety and Sustainability at the WSL. If you're listening to this podcast when we drop it, you're going to be looking forward to seeing Man United versus Chelsea in the Subway Women's League Cup Final 2026, which is going to be broadcast on BBC and Sky Sport at 2:15 UK time. I'll be tuning in. If you're listening to this after the match, you know what the final result was. You can go back in time and tell us. But for now, that's us from the Climate of Sport podcast, and we are delighted to have had you with us.
Thanks, Claire. Great to be with you.
That is a wrap on this episode of the Climate of Sport. If this got you thinking, send it to the group chat, send it to your team or someone who cares about the future of the game. Follow, subscribe, and join us next time, because the biggest wins aren't just on the scoreboard, they're out there for the planet too. See you on the next one.